Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into a world that history tried to erase. A story buried beneath silk curtains and imperial decrees where beauty became a cage and desire turned deadly. We're exploring the tragic life of male concubines in ancient China, those forgotten souls who lived in the shadows of emperors and died for the pleasure of kings. So, before you settle in for tonight's journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. Picture this. You're a young boy, maybe 12 years old, living in a village somewhere in ancient China. Your family is poor, desperately poor. Your father owes debts he can never repay. Your mother weeps at night when she thinks no one is listening. And then one day, a man in silk robes arrives at your door. He speaks in soft tones about opportunity, about service to the emperor, about honor beyond your family's wildest dreams. What he doesn't tell you is that you'll never see your family again. What he doesn't mention is that your childhood ends the moment you step through those palace gates. And what he certainly doesn't explain is that your beauty, the very thing that caught his attention, will become both your greatest asset and your ultimate curse. This is the story of the male concubines of imperial China. Boys stolen from their families, men trapped in golden cages, souls sacrificed on the altar of imperial desire. For over 2,000 years, these figures existed in the margins of Chinese history. They were the emperor's playthings, political pawns, and sometimes, if they were very lucky or very clever, the secret power behind the dragon throne. But mostly, they were victims. Victims of a system that consumed beauty like a hungry ghost, that twisted love into possession, and that discarded human lives like wilted flowers. Tonight, we're going to peel back the silk curtains and examine what really happened behind the walls of the Forbidden City. We're going to meet the boys who became men in service to emperors, the ones who survived, and the many more who didn't. And I have to warn you, this isn't a gentle story. This isn't about romance or passion or forbidden love, though those elements exist. This is about power, control, and the price of beauty in a world where human beings were bought and sold like precious objects. It's about the young men who entered the palace as children and emerged, if they emerged at all, as something else entirely. The system of male concubinage in China wasn't an accident. It wasn't some quirk of imperial taste or a brief historical aberration. It was a carefully constructed institution that served multiple purposes for the ruling class. It provided sexual entertainment, yes, but it also offered political advantages, diplomatic tools, and a way to control and manipulate the most intimate aspects of imperial life. These young men came from everywhere and nowhere. Some were tribute from conquered territories, gifts from nervous governors hoping to curry favor with the emperor. Others were purchased from families so desperate they sold their children to survive another winter. A few, the truly unlucky ones, were kidnapped outright, snatched from their homes in the dead of night and smuggled into the capital in covered wagons. But regardless of how they arrived, once they passed through those palace gates, their old lives were over. They were given new names, new identities, new purposes. They were taught to walk differently, to speak in softer tones, to lower their eyes and move with the fluid grace that Chinese court culture prized above almost everything else. They learned to play musical instruments, to compose poetry, to paint delicate landscapes on silk screens. They studied the art of conversation, the subtle dance of court politics, and most importantly, the dangerous game of keeping an emperor entertained. Because that's what it all came down to in the end. Entertainment. These young men were living, breathing diversions for some of the most powerful people in human history. They were expected to be beautiful, yes, but also witty, charming, educated, and endlessly available. They had to master the impossible balance of being desirable without being threatening, influential without being powerful, beloved without being truly loved. The training process was brutal in its own quiet way. Unlike the harsh physical conditioning that soldiers endured, male concubines faced a different kind of breaking. Their masculinity was systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to imperial specifications. They learned to move like dancers, to speak like poets, to think like courtiers. They were taught that their bodies belonged to the emperor, that their thoughts should center on his pleasure, and that their very existence depended on their ability to satisfy desires they might never fully understand. And the competition was fierce. In any given dynasty, there might be dozens or even hundreds of male concubines vying for the emperor's attention. They competed not just with each other, but with female concubines, with wives, with the pressing demands of statecraft and war. They lived in a constant state of performance, never knowing when they might fall out of favor, never certain that today's beloved wouldn't become tomorrow's forgotten casualty. The smart ones learned to read the signs. They developed an almost supernatural ability to sense shifts in imperial mood, to detect the subtle changes in court politics that could mean the difference between continued favor and sudden exile. They formed alliances, carefully calculated friendships that might provide protection when the inevitable fall came, because it always came. No concubine, male or female, stayed in favor forever. Some tried to build power bases of their own. They cultivated relationships with court officials, with generals, with the emperor's relatives. They positioned themselves as conduits of information, as informal advisors, as the voice that whispered suggestions into the imperial ear during those intimate moments after passion had cooled. A few, the truly exceptional ones, managed to accumulate real influence. They became the power behind the throne, the hidden hands that shaped imperial policy. But for every success story, there were dozens of tragedies. Young men who couldn't adapt to court life, who broke under the pressure of constant performance, who made the wrong enemy or trusted the wrong ally. Some simply disappeared, erased from records as if they had never existed. Others met more dramatic ends, caught up in palace purges or political upheavals that swept through the imperial court like deadly storms. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine being torn from everything familiar as a child, thrust into an alien world where your survival depends on your ability to please people whose motivations you can barely comprehend. Imagine growing up knowing that your value as a human being is measured entirely by your beauty, your charm, your sexual availability. Imagine living every day with the knowledge that you are, fundamentally, property. Many of these young men developed what we might now recognize as trauma responses. Some became hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats and opportunities. Others retreated into themselves, building internal walls that even the emperor couldn't breach. A few found escape in alcohol, in opium, in the various substances that could dull the sharp edges of their reality. And some, the ones who couldn't find any other way out, chose the ultimate escape. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the full tragedy of these lives, we need to understand the world that created them. We need to examine the imperial court system that made male concubinage not just possible but inevitable. We need to look at the specific dynasties and emperors who elevated this practice to an art form, and we need to meet some of the individual young men who lived and died within this system. The roots of male concubinage in China stretch back over 2 millennia to the earliest imperial dynasties. It wasn't unique to China, of course. Many ancient civilizations had similar practices, but nowhere else did it become so institutionalized, so refined, so deeply embedded in the structure of political power. The Chinese imperial system, with its emphasis on absolute authority and its complex hierarchies of status and privilege, created the perfect environment for this particular form of exploitation to flourish. The Han Dynasty, which ruled from roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE, was one of the first to systematize the practice. Han emperors maintained large harems that included both female and male concubines, though the men were often given different titles and occupied slightly different roles within the court hierarchy. They might be called favorite attendants or personal servants, or given various honorary positions that obscured their true function while elevating their status above common slaves. During the Tang Dynasty, often considered the golden age of Chinese civilization, male concubinage reached new heights of sophistication. Tang emperors were known for their cultural refinement, their patronage of the arts, and their appreciation for beauty in all its forms. The imperial court became a showcase of aesthetic achievement, and male concubines were both performers in and products of this elaborate cultural display. But it was during the Ming and Qing dynasties that the system reached its most developed and, perhaps, its most cruel form. The Forbidden City, that vast complex of palaces and courtyards that served as the heart of imperial power, contained within its walls a hidden world where hundreds of young men lived lives of gilded captivity. They were housed in special quarters, attended by eunuch servants, and subject to rules and regulations that governed every aspect of their existence. These weren't just casual relationships or temporary diversions. The imperial court maintained detailed records of its concubines, both male and female. There were rankings and hierarchies, formal titles and official positions. There were ceremonies for bringing new concubines into the court, and rituals for disposing of those who had fallen from favor. The entire system was bureaucratized, turned into just another aspect of imperial administration. And the young men caught up in this system? They learned to navigate it as best they could. Some found genuine affection, even love, within the confines of their captivity. Others discovered that their position could be leveraged into real power and influence. A few managed to accumulate enough wealth and connections to secure their future, to build lives that extended beyond their years of imperial service. But many more simply endured. They survived day by day, year by year, growing older and less beautiful, watching younger men arrive to take their places, knowing that their own future was uncertain at best. They lived in a state of suspended adolescence, their emotional development stunted by the artificial world they inhabited, their natural desires and ambitions twisted to serve purposes that had nothing to do with their own happiness or fulfillment. The tragedy wasn't just individual, though individual suffering was certainly part of it. The tragedy was systemic, cultural, embedded in the very foundations of imperial Chinese society. It was a system that treated human beings as objects, that conflated power with the right to possess and consume other people, that turned intimacy into performance and love into transaction. And yet within this tragic system, there were moments of genuine human connection. There were emperors who formed real bonds with their male concubines, relationships that transcended the purely physical or political. There were concubines who found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity despite the dehumanizing circumstances of their lives. There were acts of kindness, gestures of protection, small rebellions against the larger system of exploitation. These moments of light make the overall darkness even more poignant. They remind us that the young men we're discussing weren't just historical abstractions or symbols of imperial excess. They were real people with real feelings, real dreams, real desires for love and happiness and freedom. They were sons and brothers, friends and lovers, individuals with their own unique personalities and talents and hopes for the future. As we continue our exploration tonight, we'll meet some of these individuals. We'll learn their names when history bothered to record them, and we'll try to imagine the lives of those whose names were lost to time. We'll examine the specific mechanisms of the concubine system, the way it operated on a day-to-day basis, the relationships and hierarchies and power dynamics that shaped every interaction within the imperial court. We'll also look at the broader cultural context that made this system possible and even celebrated. We'll examine the philosophical and religious traditions that justified treating human beings as property, the aesthetic theories that elevated beauty above humanity, the political structures that concentrated so much power in the hands of single individuals that their personal desires could reshape entire societies. This is a story that Chinese historians have often preferred to gloss over or ignore entirely. It doesn't fit comfortably with either traditional narratives of imperial glory or modern stories of cultural achievement. It's a reminder that even the most sophisticated civilizations can harbor institutions of profound cruelty, that beauty and culture and artistic refinement can coexist with systematic exploitation and abuse. But it's also a story that needs to be told, not to condemn or judge, but to understand. To remember the young men who lived and died in service to imperial pleasure, who sacrificed their freedom and often their lives for the entertainment of emperors. To acknowledge their humanity and their suffering, to recognize them as individuals rather than footnotes in the histories of more famous men. So let's continue this journey together into the hidden corners of the Forbidden City, into the private chambers where power and desire intersected in ways that shaped the lives of countless young men across centuries of Chinese history. Let's meet the boys who became concubines, the men who survived the system, and the many more who didn't live to tell their own stories. Their voices may have been silenced by time and circumstance, but their experiences echo across the centuries, reminding us of the price of unchecked power and the enduring human cost of treating people as objects of desire rather than subjects of their own lives. The selection process for male concubines was an art form in itself, refined over centuries into a system that would make modern talent scouts weep with envy. Imperial agents, often eunuchs who had once walked this same path, traveled throughout the empire with the dedication of religious missionaries and the cold calculation of livestock traders. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they rarely returned empty-handed. Beauty was the obvious requirement, but not the kind of rugged masculinity that might threaten an emperor's sense of dominance. They sought out boys with delicate features, smooth skin, and an almost feminine grace. Wide eyes were prized, as were slender builds and voices that hadn't yet broken into the deeper registers of manhood. But physical beauty alone wasn't enough. The agents looked for intelligence flickering behind those wide eyes, for quick wit and natural charm that could be molded and refined. They preferred boys between the ages of 10 and 15, young enough to be shaped but old enough to survive the brutal transition ahead. Too young, and the child might not adapt to court life. Too old, and the boy's personality would already be too fixed, his masculine traits too developed to be successfully suppressed and redirected. The recruitment methods varied, depending on the dynasty and the emperor's particular needs. During times of expansion, conquered territories were required to provide tribute in the form of their most beautiful young men. Local governors, desperate to maintain their positions, would organize elaborate selection processes, parading hundreds of boys before imperial agents like cattle at market. The chosen few would be loaded onto wagons and transported to the capital, leaving behind families who might never know their children's fate. In peacetime, the methods became more subtle but no less effective. Agents would visit poor farming communities, offering desperate families what seemed like incredible opportunities. They spoke of education, of service to the emperor, of a chance for their sons to rise above their humble circumstances. They paid handsomely for the privilege, often enough silver to keep a family fed for years. What parent, watching their children slowly starve, could refuse such an offer? Some boys were sold outright by families who saw them as burdens rather than blessings. In a culture that prized sons for their ability to carry on the family name and care for aging parents, a boy destined for imperial service represented a loss of future security. But the immediate payment often outweighed long-term considerations, especially for families already teetering on the edge of survival. The journey to the capital was the first test of survival. Boys were transported in covered wagons, packed together like precious cargo, fed just enough to keep them alive and healthy. Those who showed signs of illness or weakness were often abandoned along the roadside, their imperial dreams ending before they even reached the palace gates. The smart ones learned quickly to hide any discomfort, to present a facade of health and eagerness, even when they were terrified and homesick. Upon arrival at the imperial complex, the real transformation began. The boys were housed in special quarters, separated from the outside world by walls that might as well have been built from their own lost dreams. They were bathed, examined by court physicians, and subjected to a process that can only be described as systematic dehumanization, disguised as refinement. Their old clothes were burned, along with any personal possessions that might remind them of their former lives. They were given new garments, silk robes in colors chosen to complement their complexion and enhance their youthful beauty. Their hair was styled according to court fashion, often in elaborate arrangements that took hours to complete and required constant maintenance. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to the psychological reconditioning that followed. The boys were assigned to older concubines, who served as mentors, teachers, and sometimes tormentors. These men, themselves products of the same system, understood that survival depended on absolute compliance with imperial expectations. They had learned to bury their own masculinity so deeply that they could guide others through the same process. The training was comprehensive and unrelenting. The boys learned to walk with small, precise steps, their movements fluid and graceful. They practiced sitting, standing, and kneeling in ways that emphasized their delicate beauty while minimizing any suggestion of masculine strength. They were taught to lower their voices, to speak in soft, melodious tones that would please the imperial ear. Music and poetry, became their primary subjects of study. They learned to play the guqin and pipa, traditional instruments that produced sounds as delicate and refined as they were expected to become. They memorized hundreds of classical poems, learning to recite them with the perfect inflection and timing that would demonstrate their cultural sophistication. Some showed natural talent for composition, creating their own verses that celebrated imperial glory, while subtly advertising their own charms. The art of conversation was perhaps the most crucial skill they acquired. They learned to be entertaining without being dominating, witty without being threatening, intelligent without appearing to challenge imperial authority. They studied current events so they could provide informed commentary when required, but they also learned when to remain silent, when their role was simply to be beautiful and available rather than intellectually engaging. Physical training focused on flexibility and grace rather than strength or martial prowess. They practiced dance, learning movements that emphasized their lithe bodies and natural elegance. They studied the subtle art of massage, techniques that could soothe imperial tensions while providing intimate physical contact. They learned to apply cosmetics to enhance their natural beauty with powders and pigments that gave them an almost otherworldly appearance. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to read people, to interpret the subtle signals that might mean the difference between continued favor and sudden dismissal. They studied the emperor's moods, his preferences, his fears and desires. They memorized the faces and relationships of court officials, understanding that their survival might depend on knowing who held real power and who was merely playing at importance. The competition among the concubines was intense and never-ending. New boys arrived regularly, their fresh beauty and eager enthusiasm making older concubines suddenly seem tired and familiar. The smart ones learned to form alliances, creating networks of mutual protection and support. But they also understood that ultimately, every other concubine was a rival, a potential threat to their own position and survival. Some tried to differentiate themselves through specialized skills. One might become known for his calligraphy, another for his ability to tell amusing stories, a third for his knowledge of herbal remedies that could ease imperial ailments. They became living, breathing entertainment systems, each one offering a different form of diversion for their imperial master. The psychological pressure was enormous. These young men lived in a state of constant performance, never able to relax, never able to simply be themselves. They woke each morning knowing that their value as human beings would be measured entirely by their ability to please someone whose desires they might never fully understand or predict. They went to sleep each night, wondering if they would still be in favor when they woke. Many developed elaborate coping mechanisms. Some retreated into fantasy, creating rich inner worlds where they were heroes of their own stories, rather than supporting characters in someone else's drama. Others found solace in small rituals, in the careful arrangement of personal belongings, or the precise performance of daily routines that gave them some sense of control over their environment. The physical toll was significant as well. The constant stress, combined with irregular eating and sleeping patterns, took its toll on their health. Many suffered from digestive problems, headaches, and various nervous conditions that had no name but were perfectly understood by their fellow concubines. Some turned to alcohol or opium for relief, substances that were readily available within the palace, but came with their own risks and complications. Yet within this system of exploitation and control, genuine human connections sometimes formed. Friendships developed between concubines, who recognized kindred spirits in their shared suffering. Some found mentors among the older men who remembered what it was like to be young and terrified and far from home. Occasionally, even romance bloomed, secret relationships that had to be carefully hidden from imperial eyes, but provided emotional sustenance in an otherwise barren landscape. The relationship between concubines and eunuchs was particularly complex. The eunuchs, having been physically altered to serve the imperial court, occupied a strange middle ground between the world of men and the world of concubines. Some became protectors and advocates, using their positions within the palace hierarchy to shield vulnerable young men from the worst excesses of imperial caprice. Others, perhaps embittered by their own experiences, became cruel taskmasters who took out their frustrations on those even more powerless than themselves. As the months and years passed, the boys who had entered the palace as children began to mature into men. Though men shaped by experiences unlike any their peers in the outside world could imagine, they developed a peculiar form of wisdom, an understanding of human nature and power dynamics that came from years of careful observation and calculated survival. They learned to hide their true thoughts and feelings behind masks of compliance and enthusiasm, becoming masters of emotional camouflage. Some found ways to accumulate small amounts of wealth and influence. They might be rewarded with gifts from pleased emperors, or they might receive payments from court officials who valued their insights into imperial moods and preferences. The clever ones learned to save and invest these resources, building small networks of obligation and favor that might protect them in times of trouble. But for all their adaptability and resilience, these young men remained fundamentally trapped. They were prisoners in golden cages, their beauty and charm the very qualities that ensured their continued captivity. They watched the seasons change through palace windows, knowing that somewhere beyond those walls, other young men their age were falling in love, starting families, building lives of their own choosing. The awareness of what they had lost, of the normal life that had been stolen from them, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their situation. They had been old enough when they arrived to remember what freedom felt like, to understand what they were giving up. Unlike children born into slavery, they carried within them the memory of a different kind of existence, a knowledge of what life could be like for those who owned their own bodies and souls. And so they endured, day by day, season by season, growing older in service to men who saw them as beautiful objects rather than human beings with their own dreams and desires. Some found ways to make peace with their circumstances, to find meaning and even happiness within the constraints of their captivity. Others slowly withered, their spirits crushed by the weight of endless performance and the knowledge that they would never be truly free. Their stories, when they were recorded at all, were usually filtered through the perspectives of the emperors they served, or the court historians who wrote the official records. Their own voices, their own experiences, their own understanding of their lives were rarely considered worthy of preservation. They became footnotes in the biographies of more famous men, mentioned only when their beauty or their influence happened to intersect with events deemed significant by those who wrote the histories. But they were there, these forgotten young men, living and breathing and suffering and occasionally finding joy in the shadows of imperial power. They were witnesses to some of the most important events in Chinese history, present in rooms where decisions were made that affected millions of lives. They saw emperors at their most vulnerable, their most human, their most petty. They understood the gap between public image and private reality in ways that even the most trusted advisors never could. As we delve deeper into their world, we begin to understand that their tragedy was not just personal, but cultural, a reflection of values and systems that treated human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and consumed. Their suffering was not accidental, but intentional, built into the very structure of a society that confused power with the right to possess other people. Yet within that tragedy, there were also moments of transcendence, instances where human dignity and resilience shone through even the darkest circumstances. There were acts of kindness and courage, small rebellions against the larger system of oppression, connections forged between human souls that no amount of imperial power could completely destroy. These young men deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals who found ways to maintain their humanity in inhuman circumstances. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, but they were not entirely passive in their own stories. They made choices, formed relationships, created meaning, and left their mark on the world in ways both subtle and profound. Their legacy is not just one of suffering, but of survival, of the remarkable ability of the human spirit to adapt and endure even in the most challenging circumstances. They remind us that history is not just the story of kings and battles and great events, but also the story of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, trying their best to make sense of their lives and find happiness wherever they could. Their days began before dawn, in the hours when the palace lay shrouded in silence and shadow. While the emperor slept behind silk curtains, the male concubines would rise quietly, their movements practiced and precise. There was no leisurely awakening, no moment of peaceful transition between sleep and consciousness. They woke with the automatic alertness of prey animals, instantly aware of their surroundings and their obligations. The morning routine was elaborate and unforgiving. They would bathe in water scented with jasmine and chrysanthemum, scrubbing away the previous day's exhaustion and preparing their bodies for another performance. Their skin had to be perfect, unmarked by blemish or imperfection. Any sign of illness or fatigue had to be carefully concealed with powders and rouge, transforming them into living works of art. Dressing was a ritual that could take hours, layer upon layer of silk, each garment chosen to enhance their delicate beauty. The colors were never random, selected instead to complement their complexion and catch the light in ways that would please the imperial eye. Jewelry was applied with mathematical precision, each piece positioned to draw attention to their most attractive features while maintaining the overall harmony of their appearance. Their hair required the most attention of all, elaborate styles that defied gravity and common sense, held in place with combs carved from precious wood and pins tipped with pearls. Some styles were so complex they required assistance from other concubines, creating a web of interdependence that both protected and threatened their individual positions. A poorly placed pin or an unnoticed strand could mean the difference between imperial favor and dismissal. Breakfast was a careful affair, if they were permitted to eat at all. Their figures had to remain slender, their movements graceful, their energy levels perfectly calibrated to imperial expectations. Some emperors preferred their concubines to appear ethereal, almost otherworldly in their delicacy. Others wanted them healthy and vibrant, glowing with youth and vitality. The concubines learned to read these preferences and adjust their habits accordingly. Once prepared, they would wait. Waiting became the defining experience of their lives, a skill they mastered with the dedication of scholars studying ancient texts. They waited to be summoned, waited to be noticed, waited to be chosen for imperial attention. The waiting rooms were studies in controlled tension, filled with young men who had perfected the art of appearing relaxed while remaining instantly ready to spring into action. The hierarchy among them was complex and ever-shifting. New arrivals were automatically placed at the bottom, forced to prove themselves worthy of attention. But youth and novelty carried their own advantages, and an eager newcomer could quickly surpass concubines who had served for years. Age was the enemy in this world, each passing season bringing them closer to irrelevance and disposal. Some tried to slow the inevitable march of time through elaborate beauty regimens. They applied creams made from ground pearls and bird's nest soup, believing these exotic ingredients could preserve their youthful appearance. They practiced facial exercises designed to prevent wrinkles, slept with their heads elevated to avoid puffiness, and carefully monitored their diet to maintain their slender figures. Others focused on developing skills that might sustain them beyond their physical prime. They became experts in massage techniques that could ease imperial stress, learned to brew teas that would calm troubled minds, mastered the art of conversation that could entertain even the most jaded emperor. These men understood that beauty was temporary, but usefulness could extend their careers and perhaps even their lives. The competition for imperial attention created a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Every interaction was analyzed, every gesture scrutinized for signs of imperial favor or displeasure. A smile that lasted a moment too long, a glance that seemed too bold, a response that appeared too clever could all be interpreted as threats to imperial authority. The concubines learned to walk a razor's edge between being interesting enough to hold attention and dangerous enough to be eliminated. When the emperor did choose to spend time with them, the experience was both the culmination of their training and a test of their survival skills. They had to be whatever the emperor needed in that moment, whether it was a listening ear for political frustrations, a skilled musician to provide entertainment, or simply a beautiful object to admire. Their own desires, their own comfort, their own humanity became irrelevant in these moments. The emperor's moods were weather systems that determined the climate of their entire world. A day when he woke happy and content could bring gifts, praise, and elevated status. But a morning when he felt troubled or dissatisfied might result in arbitrary punishments, sudden demotions, or worse. The concubines learned to read these moods with the precision of meteorologists, adjusting their behavior to match the imperial atmosphere. Privacy became a foreign concept. Every moment of their lives was potentially subject to imperial scrutiny. They ate, slept, bathed, and relieved themselves under the watchful eyes of eunuch servants who reported back to their superiors. Their conversations were monitored, their friendships evaluated for potential threats, their expressions analyzed for signs of discontent or rebellion. The psychological pressure created its own form of madness. Some concubines developed elaborate superstitions, believing that specific rituals or behaviors could influence their fate. Others became obsessed with cleanliness, scrubbing their skin until it was raw in a desperate attempt to achieve the perfection they believed would save them. A few retreated so far into themselves that they seemed to exist in a permanent state of dreamy detachment from reality. Letters from home, when they were permitted at all, became precious treasures. Most concubines never received news of their families, their old lives erased as completely as if they had never existed. But occasionally, through bribery or special favor, Word would reach them of a parent's death, a sibling's marriage, or the birth of nephews and nieces they would never meet. These glimpses of the world they had lost were both gifts and tortures, reminders of the normal life that continued without them. Some found solace in religion, though even their spiritual practices were constrained by imperial expectations. They might pray to Buddhist deities for compassion, to Taoist spirits for harmony, or to Confucian ancestors for guidance. But their prayers had to be silent, their devotions private, their hopes carefully hidden behind masks of secular compliance. The seasons marked the passage of time in ways both beautiful and cruel. Spring brought new flowers to the palace gardens, but also new concubines to replace those who had aged out of favor. Summer festivals provided opportunities for entertainment and display, but also increased competition for imperial attention. Autumn harvests filled the palace with abundance, but reminded them of homes and families they would never see again. Winter brought a kind of peace, but also the knowledge that they were another year older, another year closer to obsolescence. Disease was a constant threat in the close quarters of the palace. A single case of smallpox or plague could devastate the concubine population, but illness also provided opportunities for those who possessed medical knowledge. Some concubines became skilled in herbal remedies, using their healing abilities to gain favor and protection. Others specialized in preventing disease, becoming experts in hygiene and diet who could help the emperor maintain his health. The arrival of foreign dignitaries created special challenges and opportunities. Concubines might be called upon to entertain visiting ambassadors, to demonstrate the sophistication and refinement of the Chinese court. These performances required not just beauty and charm, but also cultural knowledge and diplomatic sensitivity. A successful interaction with foreign guests could elevate a concubine's status, while a misstep could result in disgrace or worse. Technology and fashion evolved around them, but they remained frozen in their roles as living art objects. They watched as the world outside the palace walls changed, as new ideas and innovations transformed Chinese society, but their own lives remained constrained by traditions that stretched back centuries. They were relics of an ancient system, preserved like insects in amber. Beautiful but ultimately lifeless. The concept of romantic love became twisted beyond recognition in their world. They might develop feelings for the emperor, but these emotions had to be carefully managed and expressed only in ways that enhanced imperial ego rather than challenging imperial authority. Love between concubines was even more dangerous, a potential source of loyalty that might compete with their devotion to the emperor. Any relationship that threatened the primacy of imperial desire was ruthlessly suppressed. Education continued throughout their service, but it was education designed to make them more valuable as objects rather than more capable as human beings. They studied poetry to better entertain the emperor, learned music to provide pleasant background sounds, mastered calligraphy to create beautiful decorations. Their intelligence was cultivated only insofar as it served imperial pleasure. Their creativity channeled into forms that would never threaten the established order. The palace itself became both sanctuary and prison. Its beautiful gardens and elegant architecture provided a setting of unparalleled luxury, but every door was guarded, every path monitored. They lived surrounded by the finest things human civilization could produce, but they could not truly possess any of it. They were inhabitants of paradise who had been denied the freedom to leave, guests at an eternal party who could never go home. Economic considerations shaped their world in ways both obvious and subtle. They represented significant investments of imperial resources, their training and maintenance costly endeavors that had to be justified through their utility and longevity. The emperor's accountants tracked their expenses like any other court expenditure, calculating the return on investment in terms of imperial satisfaction and political advantage. Some concubines developed entrepreneurial skills, finding ways to generate income through small services to other court members. They might write letters for illiterate servants, provide beauty treatments to palace women, or offer entertainment at private gatherings. These activities were technically forbidden, but they were often overlooked if they remained discreet and didn't interfere with imperial duties. The relationship between male and female concubines was complex and often competitive. They vied for the same imperial attention, occupied similar positions in the court hierarchy, and faced many of the same challenges and dangers. But they also represented different kinds of threats and opportunities to each other. Male concubines might ally with influential female concubines for protection, or they might find themselves displaced by women who offered the emperor different kinds of satisfaction. As they aged, the lucky ones might transition into advisory roles, using their accumulated knowledge of court politics and imperial preferences to guide younger concubines. These elder statesmen of the concubine world walked a delicate line between helpfulness and competition, offering assistance while protecting their own precarious positions. Their experience made them valuable, but their advanced age made them vulnerable to replacement by fresher faces and younger bodies. The rituals surrounding imperial birthdays, festivals, and other celebrations provided both opportunities and perils. These events required elaborate preparations, with each concubine competing to provide the most memorable entertainment or the most thoughtful gift. Success could mean elevation in status and increased favor, but failure could result in punishment or banishment. Death, when it came, often arrived without ceremony or recognition. Concubines who died in service were typically buried in unmarked graves, their passing noted only in administrative records that tracked imperial property. Their families, if they still lived, might never learn of their fate. They simply vanished from the world as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only the memories of those who had shared their captivity. But for those who survived, who managed to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial favor long enough to reach old age, there remained the question of what came next. Some were retired to distant estates, provided with modest pensions, and left to live out their remaining years in obscurity. Others were retained as advisors or administrators, their accumulated wisdom finally recognized as valuable in its own right. A very few, the most exceptional and fortunate, managed to accumulate enough wealth and influence to secure their own futures. They might establish businesses, acquire property, or even arrange marriages that would provide them with the families they had been denied in their youth. These success stories, rare as they were, provided hope to the younger concubines who still believed that survival and eventual freedom were possible. The system that created and sustained male concubinage was remarkably resilient, adapting to changing dynasties and evolving social conditions while maintaining its essential character. New emperors might modify the details, but the fundamental relationship between imperial power and sexual exploitation remained constant. The faces changed, the names were forgotten, but the tragedy continued generation after generation. Yet within this system of oppression and control, human dignity somehow persisted. The concubines found ways to maintain their sense of self, to preserve their humanity, despite every effort to reduce them to mere objects. They formed friendships, created art, told stories, and passed down wisdom to those who came after them. They refused to be completely broken, even when everything around them was designed to ensure their submission. Their resistance was quiet, but persistent, expressed through small acts of defiance that might go unnoticed by their captors, but were deeply meaningful to their fellow prisoners. A knowing glance, a shared joke, a moment of genuine human connection, these became acts of rebellion against a system that sought to deny their humanity. As we peer deeper into their world, we begin to understand that their story is not just about individual suffering, but about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the human cost of treating people as possessions. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, but they were not entirely powerless in their own narratives. They found ways to survive, to maintain their dignity, and to create meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Their legacy is complex and contradictory, marked by both tragedy and resilience, oppression and adaptation. They were victims of a cruel system, but they were also survivors who found ways to preserve their essential humanity despite every effort to destroy it. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human capacity for endurance and hope can never be completely extinguished. The palace walls that contained them have long since crumbled. The emperors they served have been dust for centuries, but their memory lingers in the shadows of history. They deserve to be remembered not just as footnotes in the biographies of more famous men, but as individuals who lived and loved and suffered and endured in one of history's most challenging circumstances. Their voices may have been silenced by time and oppression, but their experiences continue to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of the price of unchecked power and the enduring strength of the human spirit. They were more than beautiful objects, more than imperial playthings, more than historical curiosities. They were human beings who deserved better than the fate that befell them, and their memory deserves better than the obscurity to which history has consigned them. The imperial bedchamber was both stage and prison, a silk-draped theater where performances could mean the difference between life and death. When summoned to these private quarters, a concubine entered a world where every breath, every glance, every whispered word carried the weight of survival. The emperor's desires were not requests to be considered, but commands to be fulfilled with absolute precision and apparent enthusiasm. The chamber itself was designed to overwhelm the senses. Incense burned in golden braziers, filling the air with clouds of sandalwood and jasmine that were meant to create an otherworldly atmosphere. Silk tapestries depicted scenes from classical literature, romantic encounters between immortals and mortals that served as both decoration and instruction. The bed, massive and draped in layers of the finest fabric, dominated the space like an altar dedicated to imperial pleasure. But for the young men who entered these chambers, the luxury was meaningless. They understood that beneath the beautiful facade lay something far more sinister. They were not guests in this opulent space. They were instruments, tools to be used for imperial satisfaction and discarded when their usefulness ended. The silk that surrounded them was as much a restraint as any chain, the incense as suffocating as any prison cell. The emperor's approach to these encounters varied dramatically depending on his personality, his mood, and his particular appetites. Some rulers treated their male concubines with a kind of casual indifference, using them for physical release while maintaining emotional distance. These emperors might summon a different concubine each night, sampling their collection like a connoisseur tasting wines, never forming attachments that might complicate the transactional nature of the relationship. Others developed obsessive fixations, focusing their attention on particular concubines who had captured their imagination. These imperial favorites lived lives of heightened privilege and equally heightened danger. They might be showered with gifts, elevated to positions of influence, given apartments near the emperor's own quarters, but they also became targets for the jealousy and resentment of other court members, and their elevated status made their eventual fall all the more catastrophic. The most dangerous emperors were those who confused possession with love, who convinced themselves that their desire for beautiful young men represented genuine emotional connection. These rulers might become violently jealous, punishing concubines for imagined slights or perceived disloyalty. They might demand exclusive devotion while continuing to collect new concubines, creating impossible emotional demands that no human being could satisfy. The concubines learned to read these imperial personalities with the skill of scholars studying ancient texts. They developed an almost supernatural ability to sense mood shifts, to detect the subtle changes in breathing or posture that might signal a change in imperial desire. A slight tension in the emperor's shoulders might mean he wanted gentle conversation. A particular way of reclining might indicate he preferred to be entertained with music or poetry. The wrong interpretation could result in punishment or dismissal. Physical intimacy in these encounters was always on imperial terms, following patterns and preferences that the concubines had to memorize and execute flawlessly. They learned to suppress their own reactions, their own comfort or discomfort, focusing entirely on providing whatever experience the emperor desired. Their bodies became instruments to be played by imperial hands, their own pleasure or pain irrelevant to the performance. Some emperors preferred their concubines to remain passive, beautiful objects to be admired and manipulated. Others wanted them to feign enthusiasm, to perform desire they didn't feel for men they often feared or despised. The most twisted rulers demanded genuine emotion, threatening violence against concubines who couldn't convincingly simulate love and devotion on command. The aftermath of these encounters was often as challenging as the encounters themselves. Concubines had to gauge the emperor's satisfaction, reading subtle signs that might indicate whether they had pleased or disappointed their imperial master. A satisfied emperor might bestow gifts or privileges, but he might also simply dismiss the concubine without acknowledgement, treating the entire encounter as insignificant as any other bodily function. Pregnancy was impossible, but disease was a constant threat. Emperors who maintained large harems often carried infections between their various partners, and the concubines had no power to protect themselves or demand precautions. Many suffered from ailments that had no name, but were perfectly understood by the palace physicians, who treated these conditions with herbs and silence. The emotional toll of these intimate encounters was perhaps the most devastating aspect of concubine life. These young men had to compartmentalize their experiences, creating mental barriers between their public personas and their private suffering. They learned to smile and laugh during the day while carrying the weight of the previous night's degradation. They developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to survive repeated violations of their dignity and autonomy. Some retreated into fantasy during these encounters, mentally transporting themselves to other places and times. They might imagine they were back in their childhood villages, or picture themselves as characters in the romantic poetry they had memorized. Others found ways to dissociate completely, separating their consciousness from their physical experiences until the encounters became dreamlike, unreal, happening to someone else. The relationships between concubines were deeply affected by their shared experiences in the imperial bedchamber. Those who had endured similar treatment often formed bonds of understanding that needed no words. They could communicate entire conversations through glances, offering comfort and support without ever explicitly acknowledging what they had endured. But they also competed for imperial favor, knowing that their survival depended on their ability to please better than their companions. Jealousy and resentment were inevitable in this environment. A concubine who received frequent imperial attention might be resented by those who were ignored, while those who were regularly summoned might envy those who were left alone. The competition created fractures in their relationships, making it difficult to form the alliances that might have provided mutual protection. Some concubines tried to manipulate these intimate encounters to their advantage, using their access to the emperor to gather information or influence decisions. They might whisper suggestions during moments of imperial vulnerability, or use their knowledge of imperial preferences to position themselves as indispensable advisors. But this strategy was incredibly dangerous, as emperors who felt manipulated often responded with violence. The most successful concubines learned to make themselves useful beyond their physical appeal. They might become skilled in massage techniques that could ease imperial stress, or learn to prepare special teas and medicines that promoted health and vitality. Some developed reputations as good listeners, able to provide the emperor with a sympathetic ear for his political frustrations and personal concerns. But even these practical skills couldn't protect them from the inevitable march of time. As they aged, their youthful beauty faded, and their value in the imperial bedchamber diminished. They watched younger men arrive to take their places, knowing that their own relevance was slipping away with each passing season. The lucky ones might transition into advisory roles, but many simply disappeared from court life, their fate unknown and unrecorded. The emperor's death presented both opportunity and crisis for his male concubines. Some rulers made provisions for their concubines in their wills, providing pensions or property that might allow them to live independently. But others left no such arrangements, and their concubines might find themselves at the mercy of the new emperor's preferences and prejudices. Succession periods were particularly dangerous times for concubines. New rulers often wanted to establish their own harems, viewing their predecessors' concubines as reminders of the previous regime. Some might be retained if they were particularly skilled or useful, but many were dismissed, exiled, or worse. The palace that had been their entire world for years or decades might suddenly become hostile territory. The records of these intimate encounters, when they exist at all, are filtered through the perspectives of court historians who had their own reasons for emphasizing or obscuring certain details. The official accounts focus on imperial pleasure and satisfaction, treating the concubines as props in the emperor's story, rather than individuals with their own experiences and emotions. But occasionally, fragments of the concubines' own voices survive in personal letters, poetry, or memoirs written by those who managed to escape the system. These glimpses reveal the full human cost of imperial desire, the psychological damage inflicted by years of sexual exploitation, and the remarkable resilience of young men who found ways to preserve their dignity despite systematic dehumanization. The physical spaces where these encounters took place became charged with memory and trauma. Concubines who had survived multiple encounters in the same chambers often developed complex relationships with these spaces, seeing them simultaneously as sites of degradation and as familiar territories they had learned to navigate. The rooms that had witnessed their suffering also contained their small victories, their moments of successful performance that had kept them alive another day. Some emperors maintained detailed records of their encounters, rating their concubines' performances and noting their preferences for future reference. These documents, when they survive, provide chilling insights into the systematic nature of the exploitation. The concubines are reduced to statistics and evaluations, their humanity erased in favor of clinical assessments of their utility and appeal. The training that prepared concubines for these intimate encounters was itself a form of abuse, teaching young men to suppress their natural responses and desires in favor of imperial satisfaction. They learned to fake emotions they didn't feel, to endure pain without complaint, and to prioritize their captor's pleasure above their own well-being. This conditioning often left permanent psychological scars that affected their ability to form healthy relationships, even if they eventually gained their freedom. The cycle of exploitation was self-perpetuating, as older concubines who had survived the system often became complicit in training newcomers. They taught younger men the techniques and attitudes necessary for survival, passing down the knowledge of how to please imperial desire while protecting themselves as much as possible. But this mentorship was complicated by competition and resentment, as the older concubines knew that every successful student might eventually replace them. The emperor's sexual preferences shaped the entire culture of the male concubine quarters. Rulers who favored particular physical types or personality traits influenced the selection process for new concubines, while those who enjoyed variety encouraged competition and diversity among their collections. The concubines learned to adapt their appearance and behavior to match these preferences, constantly reinventing themselves to maintain imperial interest. Disease and injury from these encounters were common, but rarely acknowledged officially. Palace physicians developed expertise in treating the specific ailments that affected concubines, but their treatments were focused on maintaining the concubines' usefulness rather than promoting their health and well-being. Pain and suffering were considered acceptable costs of imperial pleasure, and concubines were expected to endure these consequences without complaint. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate trauma of the encounters themselves. Many concubines developed complex forms of Stockholm Syndrome, forming emotional attachments to the emperors who exploited them. Others experienced what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress, suffering from nightmares, anxiety, and depression that affected every aspect of their lives. Yet within this system of exploitation and abuse, some concubines found ways to reclaim fragments of their agency and dignity. They might form secret relationships with other concubines, creating bonds of genuine affection that existed outside imperial control. They might develop artistic or intellectual pursuits that provided emotional satisfaction and personal fulfillment. They might find small ways to resist or subvert imperial expectations, asserting their humanity in subtle but meaningful ways. The legacy of these intimate encounters extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the broader culture of the imperial court. The normalization of sexual exploitation created an environment where abuse was accepted and even celebrated as a sign of imperial power and sophistication. This culture influenced the treatment of other vulnerable groups within the palace and contributed to a broader acceptance of human trafficking and sexual slavery throughout Chinese society. The concubines who survived these experiences often carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. Even those who eventually gained their freedom struggled with the psychological damage inflicted by years of sexual exploitation. Many had difficulty forming healthy relationships, trusting others, or believing in their own worth as human beings. Their bodies might have escaped the imperial bedchamber, but their minds remained partially imprisoned by the memories of what they had endured. Some found healing through creative expression, writing poetry or creating art that processed their experiences and gave voice to their suffering. Others turned to religion or philosophy, seeking meaning and peace in spiritual practices that acknowledged their dignity as human beings. A few became advocates for other victims of sexual exploitation, using their own experiences to help others who had suffered similar abuse. The imperial bedchamber was more than just a private space where emperors satisfied their desires. It was a microcosm of the entire system of imperial power, a place where the absolute authority of the ruler was expressed through the complete subjugation of those who served him. The young men who entered these chambers were not just sexually exploited, they were systematically dehumanized, reduced to objects that existed solely for imperial pleasure. Their suffering was not incidental to the system, but central to its operation. The emperor's ability to command absolute sexual obedience from beautiful young men was both a symbol and a source of his power. The concubine's degradation served to reinforce imperial authority, demonstrating to all who witnessed it that no one, no matter how beautiful or talented, was beyond the emperor's reach. The silence that surrounded these encounters, the way they were hidden behind silk curtains and palace walls, was itself a form of violence. By keeping the exploitation secret, the system denied the concubines even the possibility of public sympathy or support. Their suffering was invisible, their voices unheard, their experiences dismissed as irrelevant to the grand narrative of imperial history. But their stories deserved to be told, not to sensationalize their suffering, but to acknowledge their humanity. They were more than beautiful objects, more than imperial playthings, more than footnotes in the biographies of famous emperors. They were human beings who deserved dignity, respect, and the freedom to choose their own paths in life. Their tragedy was not just personal, but cultural, a reflection of values and systems that continue to influence our world today. As we continue to explore their world, we must remember that behind every silk curtain, beneath every beautiful facade, there were real people whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. Their experiences remind us of the human cost of unchecked power and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Their memory deserves better than the obscurity to which history has consigned them, and their stories deserve to be heard by those who can learn from their suffering and work to ensure that such tragedies are never repeated. The most haunting aspect of their existence wasn't the physical abuse or even the psychological manipulation. It was the systematic erasure of their identities, the way the imperial system slowly dissolved everything that had once made them unique individuals. They arrived at the palace with names given by loving parents, with memories of village festivals and family meals, with dreams of becoming farmers or merchants or scholars. But the empire consumed all of that, replacing their personal histories with imperial mythology. Their original names were the first casualties. Upon entering the palace, they were rechristened with appellations that reflected their new purpose rather than their former selves. Names like Jade Harmony or Golden Dawn or Precious Moonlight that reduced them to poetic objects rather than human beings. These new identities were carefully crafted to enhance their appeal while erasing any connection to their previous lives. The palace administrators maintained meticulous records of these transformations, documenting not just the physical changes, but the psychological ones as well. They tracked which concubines adapted quickly to their new roles and which ones struggled with the transition. Those who showed signs of resistance or nostalgia for their former lives were subjected to additional conditioning, their stubborn humanity gradually worn away through a combination of reward and punishment. Some concubines internalized these new identities so completely that they forgot who they had been before. After years of responding to imperial names and performing imperial roles, their original selves became distant memories, half-remembered dreams that felt more like fantasies than actual experiences. They might occasionally recall fragments of their childhood, a mother's lullaby or a father's laugh, but these memories felt disconnected from their current reality. Others fought desperately to preserve some kernel of their original identity, hiding it deep within themselves like a secret treasure. They might whisper their birth names during private moments, or mentally recite stories their grandparents had told them, or practice writing characters that spelled out the names of siblings they would never see again. These acts of remembrance became forms of resistance, small rebellions against the system that sought to erase them completely. The seasonal cycles of the imperial court created their own rhythms of hope and despair. Spring brought new concubines and renewed imperial interest in youthful beauty, making older men suddenly aware of their advancing age and declining relevance. Summer festivals provided opportunities for elaborate performances that might catch imperial attention, but also increased competition among the concubines for the spotlight. Autumn was perhaps the cruelest season, as the emperor's attention often turned to administrative matters and military campaigns, leaving the concubines with long periods of anxious waiting. They would spend weeks or even months without imperial summons, wondering if they had fallen permanently from favor or if their services were simply no longer required. These periods of neglect were almost as difficult as the periods of intense attention, filled with uncertainty and growing desperation. Winter brought a kind of melancholy peace to the concubine quarters. The emperor's activities slowed, court life became more intimate, and there was time for reflection and quiet conversation. But winter also meant another year had passed. Another year of youth lost to imperial service. Another year closer to the inevitable moment when they would be too old to maintain their positions. The economic reality of their situation was never far from their thoughts. They understood that they represented significant investments of imperial resources, and that their value was constantly being calculated and recalculated by palace administrators. Their food, clothing, housing, and training all came at considerable expense, and they knew that this generosity could be withdrawn at any moment if they failed to provide adequate return on the investment. Some concubines developed a keen understanding of palace economics, learning to position themselves as cost-effective solutions to imperial needs. They might specialize in multiple skills to increase their utility, or find ways to generate income that offset their maintenance costs. Others tried to make themselves indispensable through their knowledge of court politics or their ability to gather information from other palace residents. The relationship between the concubines and the palace staff was complex and often exploitative. Eunuch administrators held considerable power over their daily lives, controlling everything from their meal schedules to their sleeping arrangements. Some eunuchs were sympathetic, having once faced similar challenges themselves, but others were cruel taskmasters who took out their own frustrations on those even more powerless than themselves. Servant relationships offered both opportunities and dangers. Lower-ranking palace workers might be bribed or befriended to provide information, small luxuries, or communication with the outside world. But these same servants could also be sources of betrayal, reporting conversations or activities to their superiors in hopes of earning rewards or avoiding punishment. The concubines learned to navigate these relationships with extraordinary care. understanding that a single misplaced confidence could result in severe consequences. They developed elaborate codes of conduct that governed their interactions with different categories of palace residents, always aware that they were being watched and evaluated by multiple sets of eyes. Language itself became a tool of control and resistance within the concubine quarters. The young men often spoke different dialects, or even entirely different languages, having been gathered from across the vast Chinese empire. The palace insisted on standardized Mandarin for official communications, but the concubines developed their own pidgin languages that allowed them to communicate privately. These secret communications became lifelines of emotional support and practical information. A concubine might warn another about an emperor's bad mood, or share advice about how to handle a particular type of imperial request. They developed elaborate systems of gesture and expression that allowed them to communicate even when verbal conversation was forbidden or dangerous. Some became skilled linguists, learning not just Chinese dialects, but also foreign languages that might make them useful as interpreters or cultural ambassadors. The emperor's interactions with foreign dignitaries sometimes required concubines who could navigate both linguistic and cultural differences, providing opportunities for those clever enough to develop these specialized skills. Religious and philosophical beliefs became sources of both comfort and conflict within the concubine community. The imperial court officially promoted Confucian values that emphasized hierarchy and obedience, but many concubines found solace in Buddhist concepts of suffering and rebirth, or Taoist ideas about harmony and natural order. These spiritual practices had to remain largely hidden, as any belief system that competed with absolute loyalty to the emperor was viewed with suspicion. But the concubines found ways to incorporate their faith into their daily routines, using meditation techniques to cope with stress, or drawing strength from the belief that their current suffering was temporary and would eventually be balanced by future happiness. Some developed syncretic belief systems that combined elements from multiple traditions, creating personal philosophies that helped them make sense of their circumstances. They might pray to Buddhist bodhisattvas for compassion, while also seeking guidance from Confucian principles about duty and service, finding ways to reconcile their spiritual needs with their imperial obligations. The arrival of new concubines created complex emotional dynamics within the existing community. Established residents might feel threatened by the youth and beauty of newcomers, but they also recognized their responsibility to help these young men survive the brutal transition to palace life. The mentorship relationships that developed were often fraught with ambivalence, as older concubines struggled to balance genuine compassion with competitive self-interest. These teaching relationships became crucial for survival, as formal training programs were often inadequate to prepare concubines for the psychological challenges they would face. The real education happened through whispered conversations and shared experiences, as older men passed down the accumulated wisdom of survival to their younger colleagues. But the knowledge being transmitted was itself corrupted by the system they all served. The lessons were about compliance rather than resistance, about adaptation rather than preservation of dignity. The older concubines taught newcomers how to suppress their natural reactions, how to perform emotions they didn't feel, how to endure degradation without breaking. In helping others survive, they were also helping to perpetuate the system that had damaged them all. The concept of friendship within the concubine quarters was complicated by the constant awareness that today's ally might become tomorrow's rival. Genuine affection developed between some of the young men, bonds forged through shared suffering and mutual understanding. But these relationships existed in a context of scarcity, where imperial favor was limited and competition was inevitable. Some concubines found ways to collaborate rather than compete, forming alliances that provided mutual protection and support. They might take turns accepting imperial attention or work together to gather information that benefited the entire group. These cooperative strategies required enormous trust and sophisticated coordination, as any betrayal could result in severe punishment for all involved. Others found that isolation was safer than connection, choosing to remain emotionally distant from their fellow concubines to avoid the pain of inevitable loss or betrayal. These men often became expert observers of human nature, developing psychological insights that served them well in their interactions with the emperor and court officials, but left them profoundly lonely and disconnected from meaningful relationships. The physical spaces of the concubine quarters reflected the contradictions of their existence. Their living areas were beautifully appointed by any normal standard, with silk furnishings, delicate artwork, and carefully maintained gardens. But these same spaces were also prisons, surrounded by walls and guards that prevented any possibility of escape. The architecture itself seemed designed to reinforce their status as beautiful objects rather than autonomous individuals. Rooms were arranged to showcase their occupants to best advantage, with strategic lighting and mirrors that enhanced their appearance while providing constant reminders of their ornamental function. Privacy was minimal, with sliding screens and open courtyards that allowed for easy surveillance, while creating the illusion of spacious luxury. Some concubines developed deep emotional relationships with these spaces, finding comfort in familiar surroundings and taking pride in the arrangement of their personal belongings. Others felt claustrophobic and trapped, seeing the beautiful decorations as gilded cage bars that reminded them constantly of their captivity. The rooms that had been intended as rewards became symbols of their imprisonment. Seasonal changes in the palace decoration provided one of the few sources of novelty in their restricted environment. The careful arrangement of flowers and artwork according to traditional aesthetic principles gave them something to anticipate and appreciate. Small pleasures that helped mark the passage of time and provide moments of genuine beauty in their difficult lives. The daily routines that structured their existence became both comfort and torment. The predictability of their schedules provided a sense of stability in an otherwise chaotic emotional environment. But the repetitive nature of their activities also emphasized the monotony of their captivity. They woke at the same time, ate the same foods, performed the same grooming rituals, waited in the same rooms, day after day, year after year. Some found ways to create variety within these constraints, developing personal rituals or private games that added meaning to mundane activities. They might arrange their belongings in different patterns, or practice different artistic techniques, or set small personal challenges that gave them goals to work toward. These tiny acts of creativity and self-determination became precious sources of agency in lives otherwise defined by external control. Others struggled with the endless repetition, feeling their sense of self slowly eroding under the weight of unchanging routine. They might develop compulsive behaviors or experience periods of deep depression that made even simple daily tasks feel overwhelming. The palace physicians had remedies for physical ailments, but little understanding of the psychological damage caused by prolonged captivity and dehumanization. Time itself became distorted in their world. Days blended into weeks, seasons into years, until many lost track of their age, or how long they had been in imperial service. The outside world continued to change and evolve, but their lives remained frozen in an eternal present of waiting and performance. They became living anachronisms, preserved examples of an earlier era's aesthetic ideals while the society around them transformed. The few who managed to maintain contact with the outside world through letters or messages faced the painful reality of how much they had missed. Siblings had married and had children. Parents had died. Entire communities had been transformed by war or natural disaster, all while they remained trapped in their beautiful prison, aging slowly and watching their youth slip away in service to imperial pleasure. Some tried to imagine what their lives might have been like if they had never been taken to the palace. They created elaborate fantasies about the families they might have raised, the careers they might have pursued, the simple freedoms they might have enjoyed. These daydreams provided temporary escape, but also deepened their sense of loss and regret. The weight of unlived life became one of the heaviest burdens they carried. They understood that their sacrifice had not been voluntary, that they had been robbed of the chance to make their own choices about love, career, family, and purpose. This knowledge created a profound sense of grief that no amount of imperial luxury could ease. Their stories were being written by others, their lives interpreted and recorded by historians who saw them only as footnotes to imperial biography. They had no voice in their own narrative, no opportunity to explain their experiences or correct misunderstandings about their circumstances. They were historical objects rather than historical subjects, things that happened to emperors rather than people with their own agency and perspective. Yet within the constraints of their captivity, they continued to assert their humanity in small but significant ways. They maintained dignity in the face of degradation, showed kindness to fellow sufferers, created beauty despite ugliness, and preserved hope despite despair. Their resilience was not just personal, but political, a quiet form of resistance against a system designed to reduce them to objects. The stories that have survived from the imperial archives offer us glimpses into individual lives, though even these accounts are filtered through the lens of court historians who had their own agendas and limitations. One such fragment tells us of a concubine known only as Autumn Jade, who arrived at the palace during the reign of Emperor Xuanzong in the Tang dynasty. He was barely 14 when the imperial agents found him working in his family's rice fields, his beauty so striking that travelers would stop to stare as he labored under the summer sun. Autumn Jade's transformation into an imperial concubine followed the typical pattern. His village clothes were burned, his hair restyled, his speech refined until he could converse in the elevated language of the court. But what made his story unusual was his exceptional musical talent. Within months of his arrival, he had mastered not just the traditional instruments expected of concubines, but had begun composing his own melodies that captured the emperor's attention in ways that mere physical beauty could not. For 3 years, he remained the emperor's favorite, accompanying him on hunting expeditions and state ceremonies. Palace records show that he received gifts worth more than most nobles saw in a lifetime. Silk robes embroidered with golden dragons, jade ornaments carved by master craftsmen, even a small estate outside the capital that generated enough income to support a comfortable lifestyle. To outside observers, he appeared to be one of the fortunate ones, a concubine who had transcended his origins to become something approaching a genuine companion to the emperor. But the fragments of personal writings that survived his eventual fall tell a different story. Hidden within the formal language, required of all palace correspondence, were subtle hints of his inner turmoil. He wrote of dreams that transported him back to his village, of music that came to him in his sleep, carrying melodies from his childhood. He described the weight of imperial favor as a burden that grew heavier with each passing day, knowing that his elevated status made him a target for jealousy and resentment from others at court. The end came suddenly, as it often did in the imperial palace. A new concubine arrived from the western provinces, a young man whose exotic features and foreign musical traditions caught the emperor's wandering attention. Within weeks, Autumn Jade found himself relegated to the background, his compositions forgotten, his presence barely acknowledged during court gatherings. The gifts stopped arriving, the invitations to private dinners ceased, and the small estate was quietly transferred to someone else. He spent his final months in the palace composing what he called his songs of departure, musical pieces that seemed to anticipate his coming exile. The melodies were haunting and complex, filled with the kind of sophisticated sorrow that could only come from someone who had experienced both the heights of imperial favor and the depths of abandonment. Some court musicians continued to play these compositions long after their creator had vanished from palace life, though they were careful never to mention the name of the man who had written them. What happened to Autumn Jade after his dismissal from court remains unknown. Palace records simply note that he was returned to his place of origin with a modest pension, but whether he actually reached his home village, whether his family was still alive to receive him, whether he found any measure of peace or happiness in his final years, these details were never recorded. He became another ghost in the long history of imperial concubinage, remembered only through fragments of music that outlived their creator. His story was repeated countless times across the dynasties, with variations in detail, but consistent themes of rise and fall, favor and abandonment. Each concubine who achieved temporary prominence created his own small legend within the palace walls, inspiring hope in newcomers, while serving as a warning about the fragility of imperial affection. They learned that success could be as dangerous as failure, that attracting too much attention could make them vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The psychological adaptation required to survive these cycles of favor and rejection was extraordinary. Concubines learned to compartmentalize their emotions, celebrating success while preparing for inevitable disappointment. They developed coping strategies that allowed them to maintain their sanity during the extreme fluctuations of their circumstances, finding ways to preserve their sense of self even as their external circumstances changed dramatically. Some found stability in routine, maintaining the same daily practices regardless of their current status in the imperial hierarchy. They would rise at the same time, perform the same grooming rituals, practice the same artistic disciplines, creating islands of predictability in their chaotic emotional landscape. These routines became anchors that kept them grounded when everything else in their world was shifting. Others learned to find meaning in the temporary nature of their circumstances, embracing a Buddhist philosophy that viewed both success and failure as illusions that would eventually pass away. They cultivated a kind of detachment that allowed them to experience imperial favor without becoming too attached to it, understanding that their current situation was no more permanent than any other aspect of human existence. The most successful developed what might be called strategic emotional intelligence, learning to read not just the emperor's moods, but the broader currents of court politics that might affect their positions. They understood that their individual relationships with the emperor existed within a larger context of factional struggles, family rivalries, and administrative changes that could impact their lives in ways that had nothing to do with their personal performance or appeal. These politically astute concubines often survived longer than their more naive colleagues, not because they were more beautiful or talented, but because they understood the game being played around them. They formed alliances with court officials who might protect them during transitions, cultivated relationships with imperial family members who could provide alternative sources of patronage, and positioned themselves as valuable sources of information and influence. But even the most clever and adaptable concubines could not completely escape the fundamental vulnerability of their position. They remained property of the imperial household, subject to disposal at the emperor's whim or the whims of those who might succeed him. Their accumulated wealth, their carefully cultivated relationships, their artistic achievements, all of these could be stripped away in a moment if they fell afoul of palace politics or simply failed to maintain their usefulness. The arrival of new dynasties created particularly dangerous periods for imperial concubines. New rulers often wanted to establish their own harems and court cultures, viewing their predecessors' concubines as reminders of the previous regime. These transition periods saw massive purges of palace personnel, with concubines often bearing the brunt of the new order's desire to eliminate any potential sources of loyalty to the fallen dynasty. Some concubines attempted to navigate these transitions by demonstrating their usefulness to the new regime, offering their knowledge of palace operations or their skills in administration and cultural affairs. But these attempts at reinvention were risky, as they required the concubines to essentially betray their former masters while simultaneously proving their loyalty to new ones. Many who attempted this delicate balancing act found themselves trusted by neither side and vulnerable to elimination by both. The lucky few who survived dynastic transitions often did so by becoming invisible, fading into the background of palace life until they were forgotten by those in power. They might spend their remaining years in obscure positions, maintaining gardens or teaching music to younger concubines, their former prominence erased, but their lives preserved. These survivors became living repositories of palace history, carrying within their memories the secrets and stories of fallen empires. Their accumulated knowledge made them valuable in subtle ways, as new concubines sought them out for advice and guidance. These elder statesmen of the concubine world walked careful lines between helpfulness and competition, offering assistance while protecting their own precarious positions. Their experience had taught them that survival required constant vigilance and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances without losing sight of their ultimate goal of staying alive. The relationships they formed with younger concubines were complex mixtures of mentorship, competition, and mutual protection. They understood that their survival might depend on their ability to make themselves useful to the next generation, but they also knew that every successful student represented a potential threat to their own continued relevance. These intergenerational dynamics created layers of tension and cooperation that shaped the entire culture of the concubine quarters. Some older concubines became bitter and cruel, taking out their frustrations on newcomers who reminded them of their own lost youth and beauty. They might sabotage younger men through bad advice or deliberate misinformation, seeing their suffering as compensation for their own years of degradation and loss. These toxic mentors created cycles of abuse that perpetuated the system's cruelty across generations. Others found redemption in genuine care for their younger colleagues, using their experience to shield newcomers from some of the worst aspects of concubine life. They might provide practical advice about surviving imperial attention, emotional support during difficult transitions, or simply the comfort of knowing that someone understood their experiences. These compassionate mentors created pockets of humanity within an otherwise dehumanizing system. The physical toll of years in imperial service became increasingly apparent as concubines aged. The stress of constant performance, combined with irregular eating and sleeping patterns, left many with chronic health problems that palace physicians could treat but not cure. They suffered from digestive disorders, nervous conditions, and various ailments that had no specific names but were perfectly understood by those who shared their experiences. Some developed addictions to alcohol or opium as ways of coping with their circumstances. Substances that were readily available within the palace, but came with their own dangers and complications. These chemical escapes provided temporary relief from psychological pain, but often created new problems that complicated their already difficult lives. Palace administrators tolerated these vices as long as they didn't interfere with imperial service, but they also used them as tools of control and manipulation. The lucky few who maintained their physical and mental health into their later years often found themselves in unique positions within the palace hierarchy. Their survival alone marked them as exceptional, and their accumulated knowledge made them valuable advisors to both emperors and fellow concubines. Some transitioned into administrative roles, using their understanding of court culture and human psychology to help manage the complex social dynamics of palace life. These successful survivors often became the unofficial historians of concubine culture, preserving stories and traditions that might otherwise have been lost. They remembered the names of forgotten favorites, the details of historical scandals, the patterns of imperial behavior that repeated across generations. Their memories became libraries of human experience, repositories of knowledge about survival in impossible circumstances. But even their success was shadowed by the knowledge of what they had sacrificed to achieve it. They had outlived their youth, their beauty, their dreams of normal life, and in many cases, their capacity for genuine human connection. They were living testaments to the possibility of survival, but also walking reminders of the price that survival demanded in the imperial palace. Their stories, fragmented and filtered though they may be, provide us with our clearest glimpses into the human reality of male concubinage in imperial China. Through their experiences, we can begin to understand not just the mechanics of the system, but its emotional and psychological impact on the individuals who lived within it. They were more than just beautiful objects or imperial playthings. They were human beings who found ways to preserve their dignity and humanity in circumstances designed to strip both away. The weight of their collective suffering presses down through the centuries, reminding us that behind every historical system of oppression were real people who paid the price for others' power and pleasure. Their voices may have been silenced by time and circumstance, but their experiences continue to speak to us, challenging us to remember their humanity and to work toward a world where such exploitation is no longer possible. As we prepare to delve deeper into the specific mechanisms of their daily existence, the relationships that sustained them, and the forces that ultimately destroyed so many of them, we carry with us the knowledge that these were not abstract historical figures, but real people whose lives mattered, whose suffering was genuine, and whose memory deserves better than the obscurity to which history has consigned them. Their stories are part of our shared human heritage, reminders of both our capacity for cruelty and our potential for resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. Tonight, as we reach the end of our journey through the silken corridors and shadowed chambers of imperial China, we're left with a truth that cuts deeper than any sword. The system of male concubinage wasn't an aberration or a brief historical curiosity. It was a machine carefully constructed and meticulously maintained across millennia, designed to consume human beauty and transform it into imperial power. The young men we've met tonight, those whose names were erased and whose voices were silenced, represent something larger than individual tragedy. They were casualties of a worldview that treated human beings as commodities, that confused possession with love, that elevated aesthetic pleasure above human dignity. Their suffering was not accidental, but intentional, built into the very foundations of imperial culture. Consider the mathematics of their existence. Across 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history, hundreds of thousands of boys were taken from their families and transformed into living ornaments for imperial pleasure. Each one had a mother who wept for his disappearance, siblings who wondered what became of their brother, dreams that were cut short before they could fully form. The scale of this human cost is staggering when we allow ourselves to truly contemplate it. But perhaps most haunting is how completely the system succeeded in its goal of erasure. These young men were deliberately written out of history, their experiences dismissed as unworthy of record, their humanity denied even in death. They became footnotes in the biographies of emperors, mentioned only when their beauty or their influence happened to intersect with events deemed significant by those who controlled the narrative. Yet their absence from official records tells its own story. The very silence surrounding their lives speaks to the shame and secrecy that surrounded the system that created them. Even the emperors who exploited them understood on some level that what they were doing was morally indefensible. The elaborate justifications, the poetic language, the cultural traditions that legitimized their suffering, all of these were attempts to disguise a simple truth. Powerful men were destroying young lives for their own pleasure. The ripple effects of this system extended far beyond the palace walls. Families were shattered by the loss of their sons. Communities were terrorized by the knowledge that their most beautiful children might be taken at any moment. An entire culture was corrupted by the normalization of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. The empire that prided itself on moral philosophy and cultural refinement was built, in part, on the systematic abuse of its most vulnerable members. And what of the emperors themselves? These men who possessed absolute power over millions of lives, who could command armies and reshape nations with a word, were themselves prisoners of their own desires. Their inability to form genuine human connections, their paranoia and isolation, their dependence on constant stimulation and novelty, these were the inevitable consequences of a system that treated other people as objects for consumption. The concubines they used and discarded were mirrors reflecting their own spiritual emptiness. In destroying these young men's capacity for authentic emotion, they destroyed their own ability to experience genuine love or friendship. They were surrounded by people who performed affection for survival, who smiled while they suffered, who gave their bodies while withholding their souls. The emperors lived in worlds of elaborate deception, never knowing if any emotion directed toward them was real. The palace eunuchs who administered this system were themselves victims who had become perpetrators, men who had been mutilated in childhood and then spent their lives facilitating the abuse of others. The female concubines who competed with their male counterparts for imperial attention were trapped in the same web of exploitation, their own humanity sacrificed to the same altar of imperial ego. The entire court became a theater of performed emotions and calculated survival. Even the broader Chinese society was complicit in this system, creating the economic and social conditions that made it possible for families to sell their children, for communities to accept the disappearance of their young men, for an entire civilization to turn a blind eye to systematic abuse. The philosophical and religious traditions that should have protected the vulnerable were twisted to justify their exploitation. The legacy of this system extends far beyond its official abolition. The attitudes and assumptions that made male concubinage possible, the belief that beauty justifies possession, that power excuses exploitation, that some people exist primarily for the pleasure of others, these ideas didn't disappear with the last emperor. They continue to influence how we think about sexuality, power, and human worth in ways both obvious and subtle. Today, in our own time, we see echoes of this ancient system in modern forms of human trafficking, in the exploitation of vulnerable young people by those with power and wealth, in the normalization of transactional relationships that reduce human beings to objects of consumption. The technology has changed, the methods have evolved, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Those with power taking advantage of those without it. The stories of these forgotten concubines remind us that human dignity is not negotiable, that no amount of luxury or cultural sophistication can justify the systematic abuse of vulnerable people, that silence in the face of exploitation makes us all complicit in its continuation. They challenge us to look beyond the beautiful facades and examine the human cost of the systems we create and maintain. Their memory also offers us something precious, proof of the indomitable nature of the human spirit. Despite everything that was done to them, despite the systematic attempts to break their will and erase their identity, they found ways to preserve their humanity. They formed friendships, created art, showed kindness to fellow sufferers, and maintained hope even in the darkest circumstances. Their resilience was not just personal, but political, a form of resistance against forces designed to reduce them to objects. In their small acts of defiance, their quiet moments of dignity, their refusal to be completely broken, we see the eternal human capacity to transcend even the most oppressive circumstances. They remind us that no system of control, no matter how sophisticated or ruthless, can completely extinguish the spark of humanity that exists within each person. Their stories also teach us about the importance of bearing witness, of refusing to let suffering remain invisible, of insisting that every human life has value regardless of how history has chosen to remember or forget it. By speaking their names when we know them, by imagining their experiences when records fail us, by acknowledging their humanity in the face of systems that denied it, we participate in a kind of historical resurrection. We cannot undo the harm that was done to them. We cannot restore their stolen childhoods or grant them the freedom they were denied. But we can ensure that their suffering was not meaningless by learning from their experiences and working to prevent similar tragedies in our own time. We can honor their memory by creating a world where beauty is celebrated rather than exploited, where vulnerability is protected rather than preyed upon, where every person is recognized as having inherent worth that cannot be bought or sold. The silk curtains that once hid their suffering have long since rotted away. The palaces that contained them have crumbled into dust. The emperors who used them have been forgotten by all but historians. But the young men they destroyed deserve to be remembered, not as cautionary tales or historical curiosities, but as human beings who lived and loved and suffered and endured in circumstances that tested the very limits of human resilience. Their voices, silenced for so long, can still speak to us if we choose to listen. They tell us that power without accountability leads inevitably to abuse, that systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, that human dignity is too precious to be sacrificed for any amount of pleasure or political advantage. They remind us that behind every historical atrocity were real people with real feelings, real dreams, real capacity for both joy and sorrow. As we close this chapter of hidden history, we carry with us the weight of their stories and the responsibility of their memory. They were more than beautiful objects, more than imperial playthings, more than footnotes in the chronicles of more famous men. They were sons and brothers, friends and lovers, individuals with their own unique gifts and dreams and hopes for the future. They deserved better than the fate that befell them, and their memory deserves better than the silence that has surrounded it for so long. In remembering them, in speaking for them, in refusing to let their suffering remain invisible, we participate in an act of historical justice that transcends the boundaries of time and culture. Their tragedy was not inevitable. It was chosen, created, and maintained by human decisions and human systems. And if it was made by human choices, then different human choices can ensure it is never repeated. That is perhaps the most important lesson their stories can teach us, that we have the power to create a world where such exploitation is no longer possible, where every person is free to live with dignity and make their own choices about love, career, family, and purpose. The boys who became concubines, the men who survived the system, the many more who didn't live to tell their own stories. They are gone now, beyond our help or comfort. But their memory remains, a testament to human resilience and a challenge to human conscience. In their honor, and in memory of all those whose voices have been silenced by history's cruel pen, we must do better. We must be better. And we must never forget the price of unchecked power or the cost of treating human beings as anything less than fully human. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those forgotten young men who once walked the corridors of the Forbidden City, who once gazed through palace windows at a world they could never rejoin, who once dreamed of freedom while trapped in cages of silk and gold. Their dreams may have been deferred, but they need not be destroyed. In our memory, in our commitment to justice, in our refusal to let such tragedies repeat, their hopes for a better world can finally find fulfillment. Sleep well, knowing that their story has been told, their humanity acknowledged, and their memory preserved. And when you wake, perhaps you'll carry with you some small part of their resilience, their dignity, and their enduring faith in the possibility that tomorrow might bring a gentler world than the one they were forced to endure.